3B, here is Jane Pauley.
What is the drive that propels the human race? The race to push the envelope, explore the unknown. From the depths of the oceans to deep space and everywhere in between, we're a species dedicated to conquering every frontier we come across. But not everyone comes back a conquering hero. Tonight, a gripping story of who would live to tell the tale. Here's Bob McEwen with a Dateline survivor story.
The more experienced sailor one is, the more absolutely incomprehensible this journey becomes.
This may not be the end of the Earth, but you can see it from here. Elephant Island, a windswept shard of rock surrounded by the frigid waters of the Antarctic Ocean. A place so inhospitable it's uninhabited by anything but penguins and seals. So isolated by geography and weather, it's virtually impossible to reach. Yet it's become a landmark of human determination and survival. Because on April 15th, 1916, for 28 wet, frost-bitten, shipwrecked men, Elephant Island was the first dry land on which they had set foot in almost a year and a half. In their midst, their 40-year-old leader, the renowned explorer, Sir Ernest Shackleton. The actions he took over the next 3 weeks would determine whether they all lived or died. In fact, it was already a miracle he'd managed to bring them this far.
It's a kind of mark of his unshakable optimism. I think he was the kind of man who would always have believed there will be another chance.
Caroline Alexander is the author of the current bestseller about Ernest Shackleton's now legendary expedition to Antarctica aboard the ship Endurance. In December 1914, at the height of the Antarctic summer, Shackleton and a crew of 27 left the whaling station on remote South Georgia Island. Their goal? To sail 1,600 miles to the Antarctic mainland and then to claim the last remaining prize in polar exploration and become the first ever to cross the Antarctic continent.
In the year 1914, when the world prepared for war, an Irishman named Shackleton
There were
prepared for
tremendous unknowns, this notion of sort of heading out to return who knows when.
Shackleton was no stranger to uncertainty, but even he couldn't imagine what fate had planned for him this time. Almost immediately, the Endurance encountered the Antarctic sailor's worst fear: pack ice. These remarkable pictures, and even more astounding for 1914, this film, captured the view from Shackleton's ship as it rammed its way southward for 6 weeks, through ice getting thicker by the hour. Then, just 1 day's sail from the Antarctic mainland, it happened. The ice closed in and slammed shut around the ship. The Endurance and her crew were frozen in place.
They're trapped in the ice, powerless to move, but the ice itself drifts, and they just watch helplessly as they get further and further from their destination.
A month passed, then another. Sometimes they were close enough to open water to try desperately to dig their way out. But nothing worked. Shackleton and his men were soon faced with a sobering realization. There would be no way out before the onset of the long Antarctic winter, including 4 months of total darkness.
We're talking about Antarctica at a time when it was the last great unexplored territory in the world. How forbidding an environment was that?
First of all, it is bitterly cold. The temperatures went down minus 35 degrees. There are howling gales and blizzards for many days. There is an extraordinarily sinister landscape outside them, which is a black night with no light and just this acres and acres of creaking, groaning ice.
No one knew where they were. There was no way to help, even if someone did. So the Endurance became their home. The ship's provisions sustained them. Its coal furnace saved them from the deadly Antarctic cold.
Alas, Endurance was no match for the massive drifting pine.
The crew still believed that when spring arrived in September 1915, the ice would melt and they'd be free. But the diary of the ship's captain shows that secretly, Shackleton feared the worst. What the ice gets, he told the skipper ominously, the ice keeps. Within weeks, the powerful ice pack would prove Shackleton right. Exerting massive forces, the ship was helpless to resist. At the end of October 1915, after 9 months trapped in the ice, the crew had to abandon their ship. They salvaged supplies, food, and 3 lifeboats. Then, with what would be his last roll of movie film, photographer Frank Hurley captured the death throes of the Endurance as it was crushed into kindling by the ice.
After times when hope beat high and times when the outlook was black indeed, the end of the Endurance has come.
Alexandra Shackleton, the explorer's granddaughter, read for us his words, describing the emotions of watching the disastrous demise of his ship.
It is hard to write what I feel. To a sailor, his ship is more than a floating home, and in the Endurance I had centered ambitions, hopes, and desires. Now, straining and groaning, her timbers cracking and her wounds gaping, she is slowly giving up her sentient life at the very outset of her career.
Ernest Shackleton and his 27 men were now on foot, adrift on this vast ice floe. But they couldn't stay here. They had to find land. Yoked like oxen, they tried to drag the lifeboats across the rough ice. It proved impossible. Incredibly, they would spend 5 more months on the ice floe. Months of debilitating cold, in wet, frozen clothes, eating penguins and seals. Finally, in April 1916, trapped for 15 months and facing the threat of having to survive a second Antarctic winter, their chance to take to the boats arrived. Dry land, albeit on that forbidding place called Elephant Island, was 100 miles and a week's sail away. It would be 7 days of hell.
They're in open boats. They are being drenched every few minutes by breakers that just flood over the whole boat and soak them. They don't have waterproof clothing, and the water freezes on them, so that by nightfall they were clad, as it were, in icy armor.
By the 7th day, many of the sailors were close to death. If they'd missed Elephant Island, they all would surely have perished at sea. Miraculously, they didn't. After 497 days on the ice and the ocean, Ernest Shackleton and his men staggered onto land.
I couldn't believe that it was as rugged and God-forsaken a place as it actually was.
Paddy Barry knows. As a member of an expedition that tried to retrace Shackleton's path, this Irish sailor is one of the few other people ever to set foot on Elephant Island.
I'd read the descriptions, I'd seen some of the photographs, and assumed it's got to be a bit better than that. I kept expecting to find a sheltered hollow, you know, with maybe a bush or two growing, and there was none of that.
It was clear to Shackleton that he and his crew couldn't survive here either, so he had no choice but to do something that would make him a legend or cost him his life. He announced that he and 5 of his best men would sail one of the lifeboats back to the whaling station on South Georgia Island, where their adventure had started. It was a journey the likes of which no one had ever even attempted. Now, their lives would depend on this, a 22-foot lifeboat called the James Caird. Somehow, in the ice and snow, the ship's carpenter had managed to raise the gunnels about 18 inches. Then to put this canvas deck on her and fill her with a ton of stones for ballast in heavy seas. All for a journey almost everyone certainly feared would be hopeless.
800 miles. And not just 800 miles, but 800 miles across what is regarded as the most dangerous and formidable ocean on the planet.
These photographs show the little boat being loaded and launched, then disappearing into the icy surf, leaving Elephant Island and 22 crew members behind.
The men describe how they waved and cheered until the boat was out of sight, and then they sort of turned back to the beach, and one of them said, well, that's the last we'll see of them.
They knew that getting help from South Georgia Island would be a race against time, and that if the James Caird was never seen again, the men left behind on this frigid slab of rock would soon starve or freeze to death, too. And as they began to prepare for the worst, on board the James Caird, Shackleton and his crew were facing it.
At midnight, I was at the tiller and suddenly noticed a line of clear sky And then a moment later, I realized that what I had seen was not a rift in the clouds, but the white crest of an enormous wave. I shouted, "For God's sake, hold on! It's got us!"
Could Shackleton conquer the 80-foot waves of the wild Southern Ocean? Paddy Barry can't understand how, because he too tried to sail from Elephant Island to South Georgia on a replica of Shackleton's boat.
Outside, it was all mayhem. Waves in all directions, the wind. It was hard to see the difference between where the sky ended and the sea began. We were turned right over. The boat was upside down.
Paddy capsized 3 times that night and had to give up. Back in 1916, Ernest Shackleton and his men had no such choice. If they quit, they died. But even if they and their tiny boat did manage to survive these impossible conditions, what about navigation? They had only this sextant, which was nearly useless in light of the heavy clouds obscuring the sun and the stars. How on earth could they possibly find South Georgia Island, 800 miles away in the vastness of the Southern Ocean?
We're talking about 1916.
Yeah.
No satellite navigation, no communication of any sort. And if you missed by 20 miles,
The open sea, and bye-bye and gone forever.
But through it all, Ernest Shackleton was driven by the image of those men he had left behind, huddled in a shelter made from their lifeboats, clinging to life on Elephant Island. Against all odds, on the 17th day after they desperately departed to save 28 lives, land.
It is the greatest small boat journey that ever has been achieved.
But even though Shackleton found the safety of this cove on South Georgia Island, the whaling station and help were still 20 miles away. 20 miles of seemingly impenetrable glaciers and mountains, for which there was no map because they'd never been crossed before. Shackleton and his crew, with no mountaineering equipment, had to defy the odds again. And they did. After 36 hours of climbing, on a May morning in 1916, they heard the whistle of the whaling station, their first sound of civilization in almost 2 years. But believe it or not, Shackleton's ordeal still wasn't over. The Antarctic ice, his foe to the end, prevented him from returning to Elephant Island on 3 separate attempts. It would take more than 3 months to make it back to where he had left 22 men behind, haunted by one question: how many would still be alive?
They come within sight of land, and Shackleton is staring at the beach through the binoculars. And he says, as the men come running out of the hut, he says, "I can only see 6 of them. No, there's 8. No, there's 12. He's counting, and then finally he turns on them and he says, "They're all there."
Shackleton would never again set foot on Antarctica. 6 years later, leading another expedition south, he died on South Georgia Island, where his grave lies to this day.
Oh, Shackleton, boss Shackleton, you're the bravest of them all. Oh,
The man who had set out to make history by being the first to cross the Antarctic continent instead became a legend by saving the lives of his men.
Boss Shackleton, you never lost a man.
To this day, Ernest Shackleton's rescue journey remains unmatched. Though Paddy Barry and others have done the mountain climb, only one person has completed the sea voyage, and no one has done both.